New Orleans, New Year's Eve. It's almost like a cliche at this point, right? Like you think of New Year's Eve and you think of New Orleans.
Yeah, the music, the crowds, the energy, it's infectious.
But this year, the party ended in tragedy.
Yeah, a horrific attack turned the celebration into a scene of chaos and loss.
So today we're going to take a deep dive into what happened on Bourbon Street.
We'll be using live updates and articles from Fox News Digital, basically reliving the events as they unfolded.
Exactly. It's like we're right there with the reporters and investigators piecing together the story as more information comes in.
And the goal here is to not just understand the attack itself, but to see how the narrative developed as those facts came to light.
So we're going to start with those initial reports. What was the scene like in those first few hours?
Imagine Bourbon Street, like
Yeah.
early morning New Year's Day.
Mm.
People are still out celebrating.
Right. Still carrying on from the night before.
And suddenly this pickup truck just plows through the crowd at high speed.
Oh my gosh, what a terrifying scene.
Yeah, absolutely terrifying.
Do we know anything about the casualties?
The early reports were just devastating. 10 dead, 30 injured.
And those numbers just kept rising, right?
Sadly, yes. As they got more information, the number of fatalities rose to 15.
It's just heartbreaking.
It really is. And right from the start, the police knew this was no accident.
Yeah, I was going to ask, was there any question that this might have been unintentional?
The police chief was pretty adamant, even in those early statements. He said the driver was hell-bent on causing harm. He even went around barricades that were meant to protect the crowd.
So a deliberate act from the get-go.
Seems that way. And to make things even more complicated, you had the mayor calling it a terrorist attack almost immediately.
But I thought I read that the FBI initially denied that.
You're right. There was some back and forth in those first few hours. A lot of confusion as they tried to figure out what happened.
Did they at least know who the driver was?
Yeah, they were able to identify him fairly quickly. Shamsud Din Jabbar, a 42-year-old from Houston, Texas.
Okay, so they had a name. What else were they able to find out about him at that point?
Well, the initial reports made it pretty clear this wasn't just a crash. Jabbar got out of the truck and started shooting at the police.
Oh, wow. So even more violence on top of an already horrific scene.
It was a chaotic situation.
Ugh.
He ended up getting killed in the shootout.
And what about the officers?
2 of them were shot, but thankfully their injuries were reported as stable.
So the suspect's down, but at a terrible cost?
A very high cost.
Yeah.
And as the investigation progressed, the FBI did end up confirming it was an act of terrorism.
What led them to that conclusion?
Well, a few key things came to light. First, they found an ISIS flag on the truck.
On the truck itself?
Yeah, on the trailer hitch. Pretty clear sign of ideology there.
Chillin'.
And then remember those early reports of potential IEDs.
Right. IED, improvised explosive device, for those who aren't familiar with the term.
Yeah, not something you want to hear about in a situation like this.
Yeah.
And those potential IEDs were found in the truck,
Along
along with a Glock handgun and a .308 rifle. This one had optics and a sensor on it.
This is starting to sound very planned, very deliberate.
And to add to that, remember those pro-ISIS calls for attacks you mentioned.
Right. The ones targeting New Year's Eve celebrations.
Well, it turns out there were specific calls to target events in the U.S. and Europe.
So it all starts to come together: a horrific attack, confirmation of terrorism, and potential links to a larger network. Which brings us to the big question: who was Shamsud Din Jabbar? What would lead someone to do something like this?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
We have a name, we have a face, but who was the man behind the act? And what they found out about Jabbar's background is, well, it's kind of surprising.
Surprising in what way?
He was an Army veteran.
An Army veteran. You don't usually hear about, that doesn't fit the profile you typically think of when you hear about a terrorist attack.
Right. It kind of goes against our expectations, doesn't it?
It does. So how do we reconcile this seemingly normal background with this horrific act?
Well, that's what makes this case so interesting, right? We're not dealing with a simple stereotype here. It's a lot to unpack.
So what did they find out about his time in the military?
Jabbar actually had a pretty extensive military career. He enlisted in 2004, served in the Army from 2007 to 2020.
Wow, that's a long time.
Yeah, and he was even deployed to Afghanistan from 2009 to 2010.
Afghanistan. Okay.
And he left the service as a staff sergeant.
Staff sergeant, that's not just some low-level position.
It suggests a certain level of leadership experience, responsibility.
And to add to that, he received several medals during his service, including the Army Commendation Medal, the Army Good Conduct Medal.
Wow, so we're talking about a decorated veteran here.
Exactly. Which makes you wonder even more, what could lead someone with that kind of background down this path?
That's a big question.
Did the investigation uncover anything about his life after he left the military?
Yeah, Texas authorities confirmed that he was living in Houston, and they even released some details about the truck he used.
Yeah.
Okay, what kind of details? Well, they found out he had rented the truck on December 30th.
So just a day or two before the attack.
Right, and there's evidence that he was driving it around Houston before heading to New Orleans.
So that suggests premeditation, right?
Definitely seems that way.
Okay, so you've got the FBI working the case in New Orleans. You've got Texas authorities digging into his life in Houston. Did those investigations ever connect?
They did. The FBI actually went down to Texas and searched a house they believe belonged to Jabbar.
Looking for what?
Anything that could help explain his motive or potential connections, maybe evidence of radicalization or something that could shed light on his state of mind.
And remember how we talked about the truck crossing the border?
Yeah, it was cracked entering Eagle Pass, Texas on November 16th.
November 16th. But the attack wasn't until New Year's Day. That's over a month earlier.
Yeah, and they were never able to confirm if Jabbar was even the one driving the truck when it crossed.
So many unanswered questions. Was he already planning the attack back then? Was he working alone, or were there others involved?
It's a puzzle with a lot of missing pieces.
It really is. So how did the country react to this?
Well, as you can imagine, there was a huge outpouring of grief and shock. President Biden, Attorney General Garland both expressed their condolences and pledged a thorough investigation.
A nation in mourning.
Exactly. But the reactions weren't all about unity. Then President-elect Trump, he offered condolences, but he also called it an act of pure evil.
And he used the attack to highlight his concerns about border security criminals entering the country.
Right. It's not uncommon for these types of events to become politicized. Different perspectives emerge about, the root causes and potential solutions.
And it wasn't just politicians. Even the experts were divided.
There was one former FBI official who urged caution, saying it was too early to definitively label it terrorism.
But then you had other law enforcement experts who were saying this was a very well-planned attack.
Yeah, it really highlights the complexity of defining terrorism. What makes an act a terrorist act? Is it the motive, the ideology, the method? These are tough questions.
And then there's the ripple effects, how something like this goes beyond just the immediate tragedy.
Absolutely. Think about all the travel disruptions. The airlines issued advisories about potential delays at the New Orleans airport because of heightened security.
Right, everything gets put under a microscope after an attack like this.
And then there was the Sugar Bowl.
Oh yeah, the big college football game.
That was supposed to be played that night at the Superdome, but they ended up delaying it for 24 hours.
Wow, that must have been a huge disappointment for all the players and fans.
It was, but they had to prioritize safety.
Absolutely, and there was one more detail that came out that really added to the anxiety and uncertainty.
Yeah, what was that?
There were reports based on surveillance footage that showed possible accomplices planting IEDs in coolers all over the French Quarter.
That's a game changer.
It is, because now it's not just about catching one person. It's about dismantling a potential network. Who knows what else they might have been planning?
It makes you think about the bigger picture. How big was this threat, really? Were those IEDs meant to go off during the Sugar Bowl? Were there other targets we don't even know about?
It's terrifying to think about.
It really is. And it highlights the constant behind-the-scenes work that goes on to prevent these kinds of attacks.
So we've laid out a timeline. We've looked at who Jabbar was. We've talked about some of the reactions. What's the takeaway here?
I think this attack on Bourbon Street really shows us how vulnerable these so-called soft targets are. Crowded places, celebrations, venues where security might not be as tight.
Places where people go to have fun, to let loose, to be part of something?
Exactly, and that's what makes them so attractive to those who want to cause terror.
Yeah.
The goal is to make people afraid to gather, to celebrate, to just live their lives.
And in that sense, this attack, as horrible as it was, did succeed to a certain extent. It forced everyone to confront the reality that terrorism can happen anywhere at any time.
But it also showed us something else, the resilience of the human spirit.
How so?
You see it in the first responders who ran towards danger, the medical professionals who worked tirelessly to save lives, the whole community coming together to support each other.
That's an important point. Even in the midst of such darkness, there was incredible courage and compassion.
Exactly, and that's something we need to remember. We can't let fear control us. We can't let those who want to divide us win.
So vigilance, but also hope?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Vigilance, but also hope and a recognition of our shared humanity.
This deep dive has taken us down a dark road, but it's also illuminated something beautiful. That strength of the human spirit in the face of evil.
We've examined a tragedy, a senseless act of violence that left so many scars, but we've also seen the power of unity, compassion, and that unwavering human will to heal and move forward.
And it wasn't just the political reactions. Remember, we were talking about the Sugar Bowl getting postponed. That caused a lot of controversy, too.
Yeah, some people saw it as an overreaction, but the SEC Commissioner Greg Sankey made it clear that public safety was their top priority.
It's a tough call, right? Trying to balance the need for security with the desire for everything to just go on as normal.
Exactly, and this is where those reports of accomplices planting IEDs become even more disturbing.
Right, because now you have to think about the bigger picture.
Were those IEDs meant to detonate during the Sugar Bowl? Were there other targets we don't even know about? It really makes you question the scope of this whole thing.
Scary stuff, and it makes you wonder what could have happened if those accomplices hadn't been caught.
It really highlights the importance of vigilance and the constant work that goes on behind the scenes to prevent these kinds of attacks.
So we've gone through a lot today. We've laid out the timeline. We've looked at who Jabbar was. We've talked about the reactions. What's the main takeaway here?
I think this attack on Bourbon Street really underscores the vulnerability of what we call soft targets. Crowded places, celebrations, venues where security might not be as tight as, say, an airport or a government building.
Places where people let their guard down. They're there to have fun, to be part of something.
Exactly, and that's what makes them so appealing to terrorists.
Right.
The goal is to disrupt our lives, to make us afraid, to gather, to celebrate, to just be out in the open.
And in that sense, this attack, as horrible as it was, did achieve that goal to a certain extent. It forced everyone to confront the reality that terrorism can happen anywhere, anytime.
But it also revealed something else, something really powerful, the resilience of the human spirit.
How so?
Think about the first responders who ran towards the danger, the medical professionals who worked tirelessly to save lives, the entire community coming together to support each other in the face of this tragedy.
That's a good point. Amidst all the horror, there were also incredible acts of courage and compassion.
Absolutely, and that's something we can't forget. We can't let fear paralyze us. We can't let those who want to divide us win.
So vigilance, but also hope.
Yes, exactly. Vigilance, but also hope and a recognition that we're all in this together.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've explored a truly dark event, a senseless act of violence that left lasting scars.
But we've also seen the best of humanity, the strength and compassion that shine through, even in the darkest of times.
This attack on New Year's Day was a stark reminder of the very real threats we face in the world, but it also showed us the power of unity and the indomitable spirit that allows us to heal and move forward.
And as we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final thought for you to ponder. What role does social media play in the radicalization of individuals? How can we as a society counteract the spread of extremist ideologies online? It's a complex issue, but one that deserves our attention. If we can understand the root causes, we can start to prevent future tragedies like this from happening.
It's a sobering thought, but an important one as we reflect on this event and look towards the future. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.